Hi everybody, and welcome to another edition of Video Game Stories. This time we're not taking a look at a single game, but in fact an entire genre. This video is called What Happened to Adventure Games. Now, some of you might be wondering, why isn't this video called Why Did Adventure Games Die? But because of things like Kickstarter and virtual distribution, adventure games are not dead. In fact, they're resurfacing in a big way right now. But yes, things have really changed since the golden era of adventure games, which was really the period between the late 80s and the late 90s. In the early 90s alone, more adventure games came out annually than between 2000 and 2005 alone. Now, I realize there's a lot of people out there who don't necessarily remember the good old days of adventure games and how the dynamic of adventure gaming really works. So here's a brief history lesson and a bit of an explanation for how the adventure game scene was really formed. Now, adventure games, of course, got their start in the late 70s in the form of interactive fiction, more commonly known as text adventures. Zor, Cave were some of the early examples. And then in the mid-80s is when adventure games really got a big boost, with a little game called King's Quest, which really ushered in what is now known as the graphic adventure game. And of course this came from Sierra Online, who became the first really big adventure game company. However, King's Quest was not the birth of point-and-click adventure games. Those came later, in the late 1980s, because in the early 1980s, a little invention called the mouse was not considered so much a necessity of computers as more of an accessory. And also in the late 80s is when Sierra's biggest competitor in this genre also emerged, LucasArts. They started humbly enough in 1986 with a little game called Labyrinth, based on the Jim Henson movie by the same name. But LucasArts got into the genre more seriously in 1988 when they came out with a game called Maniac Mansion, which of course introduced the Scum engine, which is what LucasArts used for most of their adventure games from there on out. And then of course the big one in 1990, The Secret of Monkey Island became the adventure game that other adventure games aspired to be. And this really began the competition between LucasArts and Sierra Online. And it can't be argued that The Secret of Monkey Island was a big reason for why a lot of independent game developers also started making their own adventure games. So really, in the early 1990s, the adventure game genre was doing super good. It had two big companies supporting it, and a lot of independent developers making their own games. So the big question, of course, is how come did the adventure game genre fall out of prominence? Well, one big factor we can definitely point to is evident if we look at two different adventure games by the same company, one made in 1990 and one in 1995. Yes, throughout the 1990s, performance power of home computers increased at an exponential rate. Screen resolutions alone quadrupled throughout the 1990s. Not to mention that due to new media like the CD-ROM and things like FMVs, adventure games and video games in general were able to do a lot more impressive things than they had ever been able to do before. This meant that the production of adventure games started to get a lot more complicated and a lot more expensive. In the early 1980s, most video games might have been programmed by a single person, and at most by teams of 5 people. By the mid-1990s, companies making adventure games were real production houses with staff of about 100 people or so. And when you have a medium like the CD-ROM at hand, which is pushing away the floppy disk, and allowing games to have things like voice acting and FMV, it of course means that companies are tempted to really utilize most of the technology available to them. And this of course means that making the game becomes more expensive. Now for big companies like Sierra Online and LucasArts, this wasn't a big deal because they had very successful games and franchises, so they were able to put in the extra money to make their adventure games more flashier and impressive. But smaller independent developers could only really utilize those technologies if they had the money to do so, and quite frequently they didn't. To illustrate the first big factor to what happened to adventure games, we only need to look at 2 adventure games that were released the same year, one by one of the industry giants, in this case LucasArts, and the other one by a small independent British company called AdventureSoft, the other game being Simon the Sorcerer 2, and the other one Full Throttle. Yes, both were point-and-click adventure games. Full Throttle supported the Windows 95, Simon the Sorcerer 2 was a DOS game. Now, Full Throttle obviously had almost twice the resolution, and while both games had voice acting, Simon the Sorcerer 2 had in-house voice acting, while Full Throttle featured professional voice actors the likes of Tress MacNeille, Kat Susie, and Mark Luke Skywalker Hamill. Simon Sorcerer 2 also had very rudimentary MIDI playback, whereas Full Throttle had a complete real audio heavy metal soundtrack by the Gone Jackals. In other words, as the technology got better and as companies were able to put more money into their adventure games, it meant that the competition got very, very steep. And those small independent developers really didn't stand a chance against companies like LucasArts and Sierra Online because they were so heavily dependent on their games actually selling well, whereas LucasArts and Sierra could have maybe one or two not so successful releases and it wouldn't really affect them. So, as smaller independent developers were beginning to get weaved out of the competition in the adventure game genre, it also didn't help that one of the two market giants also happened to fall out of the business entirely. And of course that company was Sierra Online. In the late 1990s, they were purchased by a bigger company that was trying to expand electronic entertainment. Previous CEOs of the company left, and then a few years down the line it turned out that this company that had bought Sierra was guilty of money laundering. The company ended up in massive debt, under investigations, and also they released a couple of really bad games around this time which really didn't help. And so by 1999 and Gabriel Knight 3, Sierra Online decided to just quit making adventure games and focused instead on being just a game distributor. Now you would think that losing their biggest competitor would be awesome news for LucasArts, who now had completely free reign over the whole genre. It does then beg the question, why isn't LucasArts still making adventure games? Well, in the early 2000s I used to get into a lot of arguments about whether or not Star Wars killed the LucasArts adventure games, and I guess I have to admit that I was a little wrong back then and say, yes, Star Wars definitely played a part in this. The fact that the early 2000s was the time when the Star Wars prequels were coming out meant, of course, that LucasArts had to make a lot of Star Wars games to cash in on them. So all of a sudden, Star Wars was very profitable, and adventure games really not. I mean, yes, Grim Fandango wasn't a huge commercial success despite great reviews, and Escape from Monkey Island was only a moderate improvement over that. But in the early 2000s, LucasArts was still developing a couple of adventure games. They were making a sequel to Full Throttle, and they were also working on a new Sam & Max game. But as time wore on, it became evident that LucasArts really didn't care that much about whether or not these games were ever going to get made. Which of course caused a lot of LucasArts staff to leave. Some of those people went on to form Telltale Games, and they eventually did make their Sam & Max game. The Full Throttle sequel sadly never materialized. But yes, Star Wars did kill the LucasArts adventure game because there was simply no money in it. So there you have it. In a period of about 10 years, adventure games went from being one of the most popular video game genres to almost complete obscurity. That's this video game story. I might make more videos like this if I find more interesting topics to talk about. You can suggest them in the comments if you'd like. I'm TheHande Makinen. See you on the next one.